What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. From Mtg, we like magic, and I'm here today to talk about the best control deck in Ixalan Standard, Blue-White Approach. Azorius Approach has been around for a while. You might remember that in the last Standard season, it was a deck that was sort of B-tier, would top 8 like every now and again, but with the release of Ixalan and the rotation of a few cards, I think that Blue-White Approach is firmly in the top echelon of decks right now and is easily, in the beginning weeks of Standard, the best control deck you can play. So let's take a look. Well, first, as usual, we got to talk about the creatures, which shouldn't take long because there are none. So a word on that. Hey, Julie's here now. Well, it took a while to arrive at this conclusion, but most blue-white pilots have at this point. You know, most blue-white approach decks won't play any main deck creatures. There are a couple in the sideboard, but we won't play any main deck creatures, mostly so that we can make sure that 15 to 25% of the cards in our opponent's deck are completely dead against us. A lot of decks in the current standard have a fair amount of slots devoted to removal, so playing 0 creatures means that we'll never have to worry about Hostage Taker, or Fatal Push, or Walk the Plank, or Lightning Strike, or Abrade, or Harness Lightning, or Vraska's Contempt, or a multitude of other cards that our opponent has in their deck. For when they come up against creatures, well, they're just going to be holding on to those cards literally all game. So, we're a control deck, making our opponent's cards dead is pretty much exactly what we want to do. So if we're not playing any creatures, how do we win the game? What's our win condition? Well, it's right there in the name of the deck. We're going to play 3 copies of Approach of the Second Sun. You know, one of the most interesting and sort of on-the-head comments that I keep seeing about this deck is that it's more of a combo deck than a control deck. And that kind of makes sense, because everything really revolves around this piece. You know, we've got a lot of stall in the form of removal and counter spells and stuff in the early game to get to the first approach, and then we've got a lot of card filtering to make sure we get to the second approach really, really fast. So in some ways, it kind of does feel like a combo deck. At 7 life is helpful in both aggro and mid-range matchups, and in the mirror, it's important to note that even if they counter the first Second Sun, it kind of doesn't matter. As long as you've cast one already that game, and you cast the second one, and you resolve that, then you still win the game. So even if they counter the first approach, as long as you protect the second one from being countered, you'll still win. Like any good combo deck, in quotation marks, the rest of the entire deck is set up to actually make it to our winning premise here. We gotta not only make it to 7 mana and cast Approach once, but we gotta get to it again and cast it the second time. A lot of time required to do that, so we gotta keep the board clear and protect our combo. Control deck has a lot of different ways of doing that, so we'll start with what removal we do have. I will say that Blue-White Control's sort of weak point appears to be the fact it doesn't have a whole lot of early game removal. We are playing some pieces, but we really don't have a whole lot of options. So the best way we can control the board is with sweepers, which White does have a ton of access to. We're going to play 3 copies of Settle the Wreckage and 2 copies of Fumigate. Settle the Wreckage, aka Wrath to Exile, is a real card in this format, it turns out. Really settled the argument. I've used that joke before. I don't care, I like that joke. But in any case, it's a true answer to a lot of important stuff in this format, you know. We've got to worry about the Ramanap Red matchup. First and foremost, we're trying to win Game 1 in that matchup. If we can sew up Game 1, then that matchup becomes extremely favorable to us. But it's very easy to lose Game 1 without access to a card like Settle. Whether you're on the play or the draw, you're always looking for Settle the Wreckage on turn 4 against the aggro matchup. You'll usually catch 4, sometimes 5 creatures, often at least 3, with a Settle the Wreckage that early in the game, and sometimes you'll even catch a Hazaret, which this card is a great answer to. So it's fantastic in that matchup, but that's not the only aggro matchup we have to worry about. Longtusk Cub is one of the most played cards in the format right now, and it can get out of control, and with Settle the Wreckage, you never have to worry about it coming back via Scarab God. And, should mention too, if Scarab God gets to attacking, then Settle the Wreckage is a great answer for it as well. There's buttloads of other stuff about Settle the Wreckage that's awesome, you know. Once we bring in Torrential Gearhulk from the sideboard, it's an instant we can target it. With a Torrential Gearhulk, that's a ridiculous bomb play on our opponent's turn. Can't be ignored that we can do that. Also, a decent answer for Glorybringer at instant speed should bring that up. Really, any creature with haste. This is a fine answer for, especially because you can usually catch 2 or 3 other creatures in the process with a Settle the Wreckage. Just a great card that also limits the power of things like Earthshaker Kinra and Scrap Heap Scrounger. There's just a million reasons to play Settle the Wreckage right now, and it's probably the card from Ixalan that, more than any other, makes this deck competitive. Fumigate, on the other hand, is a mana more, but it's still great in the Ramanap Red matchup. We gain a little bit of life back. Even if it doesn't kill Hazoret, that can sometimes be a bummer. It kills literally everything else in the deck. Fumigate's also one of the best answers for a Carnage Tyrant that's been brought in from the sideboard. A lot of decks playing like the 2-of Carnage Tyrant in the board. And Game 2, Fumigate is one of our best answers to that, too. So Fumigate is not only another catch-all sweeper that we kind of have to play against aggro matchups, but also takes care of specific things that the deck doesn't have a whole lot of other answers for. Altogether, 5 sweepers looks like an awful lot, but we're more or less dead in the water against really aggressive decks if we don't pack this many sweepers right now, especially considering we don't have the best targeted removal ever. But we'll go over that right now. As far as one-off removal cards in the deck, we're going to play 4 copies of Cast Out, 4 copies of Aether Meltdown, and 1 copy of Farm to Market. A Cast Out is actually one of the most playable pieces of removal in the format right now. This not only takes care of Hazoret, but also the Scarab God, and they are arguably 2 of the most important creatures in the format. They're definitely, 2 of the top 5 most important creatures in this whole format, and being able to answer both of them, usually, cleanly, is very important. And Cast Out can also draw us a card. It can take care of other non-land stuff, like Godfarer's Gift is a good example. There's just 100 targets in the format for Cast Out right now, and it's easily one of the best pieces of removal. It's also good that it's splashable. If we don't need it, we can filter it. It's just, everything about Cast Out's awesome. I like it more than Vraska's Contempt right now, which is saying a lot. As far as Aether Meltdown goes, this is actually one of the best pieces of early game removal that the deck has access to. This is essentially a 2-mana instant speed piece of quote-unquote removal that may not put the creature into the graveyard, but sometimes that's kind of a benefit, No Scarab God shenanigans, no Eternalized shenanigans or anything like that. Scrap Heap Scrounger can't keep coming back. There's lots of reasons why you might not want a creature to go to the graveyard, so that can sometimes be an upside. As far as the energy goes, we don't really care. We don't have an outlet for the energy in this deck, but we don't need one. All we're really interested in with Aether Meltdown is the fact that it's only 2 mana, it's more or less instant speed, and it can shut down a lot of different creatures in the aggro matchup in the early game, As far as Earthshaker Kinner or On-Crop Crasher goes, we don't care. Hazoret essentially only deals 1 damage to us if she's got a Meltdown on her. That's a good way of quote-unquote removing a Hazoret. Same thing goes with Long Tusk Cub, Rogue Refiner. There's a bunch of creatures that Aether Meltdown goes on really well. So Meltdown is actually, again, just one of the best pieces of removal the deck can actually play. As far as Farm to Market goes, this slot actually went back and forth a lot between Farm to Market and Disallow, which ended up in the sideboard. I was surprised that a lot of blue-white decks tend to be doing that actually right now, moving Disallow to the sideboard or not playing it in the 75 whatsoever. So we've got counterspells that just feel better. Like, most of the time, Supreme Will is just better than Disallow. So I gotta at least bring up Disallow, but the slot ended up going to Farm to Market because I really like having another early piece of removal that's good against aggressive decks. I at least want to pack as much of that as we can, but I feel like more copies of Farm to Market would be a little superfluous at this point. As far as the market half goes, there are times when we'll play this, especially if we've already played an approach and we want to filter cards to get to the second approach. We'll often play it then, but even if we're just digging for something on our main phase, then market can often come in handy, so it's at least worth mentioning, but the farm half is what we're really playing the card for. Now, we didn't play Disallow in this deck, but we still have room for 9 total counter spells. Let me show those to you. We're going to play 4 copies of Censor, 1 copy of Essence Scatter, and 4 copies of Supreme Will. Now, I should also say that this copy of Essence Scatter could also be a Disallow, especially if your format is more mid-rangey and you're facing a lot of energy decks, like 4-color energy, then I think Disallow might be the better card. But Essence Scatter has so many targets in this format, even against those energy decks. It usually has like 20+ really solid targets it can hit. So I like Essence Scatter. It's another thing that helps us out in the early game against the aggro matchup and still has a ton of targets in the mid-game. So I'm playing at least the 1 Essence Scatter. The 4 Censor, key card in this deck, again, against fast decks, especially while we're on the play. Censor is invaluable. It's never bad to draw a Censor, even if you top deck it really late game when the counterspell part of it has no relevance. You've got all the mana in the world at that point. You can easily just pay 1 and filter it to draw a card, so it never feels bad to draw a Censor, and it's fantastic in the early game, again, against all the aggro decks and stuff, but it can sometimes be relevant all the way up until turn 5 or turn 6, and it can sometimes be relevant even in the mirror match against certain things when you're in counterspell battles and stuff. So, really like Censor. It's no secret that this is one of the best counterspells we can play, and it's a 4-of in most blue-white lists that you'll see. And since Censor can counter things well into the mid-game, then sometimes Supreme Will can counter things well into the late game against certain decks. It's also amazing. Card filtering, we essentially get an impulse. That's always been great. All this at instant speed. And it's good for filtering into that second approach of the Second Sun. Seeing 4 cards is an awful lot. So once we cast our first approach, we can get a long way to that second casting of it with just 1 casting of Supreme Will. I think Supreme Will is a good card that we can segue from the counters into the card draw suite with. So let's look at all the stuff that's drawing us cards here. We've got 3 copies of Opt, 4 copies of Glimmer of Genius, and 2 copies of Search for Azcanta. Now, you won't see Opt in every blue-white list, but I think this card is more or less essential, at least in my view, because we're trying to get to a Settle the Wreckage early in some matchups, and Opt is really the only reliable card draw piece that we can play early enough to filter into a Settle the Wreckage if we don't already have one when we start the game. So just for that reason, I think Opt is important, but it also helps you win counterspell battles, helps you find counterspells when you need them, just an extra mana to filter for a counterspell while the spell you're trying to counter is still on the stack is a heck of a deal. So I'll play Opt. I think it's great in most situations. Also helps lower our land count a little bit because it's so inexpensive. I like everything about Opt. I don't see why you wouldn't play it, especially when we're trying to filter for really important cards early on in the game in certain matchups. We got Glimmer in there mostly because it's kind of pound for pound the best card draw piece in the entire format. We, again, don't care about the energy this thing gives us at all. What we care about is that we can see up to 4 cards. That's awesome. Scrying 2, then drawing 2 is just insanely powerful, especially at instant speed, doing this at the end of our opponent's turn. Or very late in the game, we can play a Glimmer in response to a spell, digging for a counter. Just Glimmer is never not good. This is always a fantastic card that lets us see a bunch of cards and is yet another card that lets us filter a bunch so that we can get to a second approach of the Second Suns really fast. Before I talk about Search for Azcanta, I just want to run some numbers real quick. If you count things like Farm to Market and Supreme Will as card draw, we've got 14 cards in this deck that draw us cards. We've got 6 lands that cycle. We've got 8 cards that cycle for a mana. So almost half of our deck draws us cards. We're drawing more cards than a Hallmark artist in this deck. So we kind of make up for the fact that we have sort of weak early game removal. With the fact that we card filter and draw cards so well so that we can get specific answers when we do need them. We may not be able to play so much good early game or even mid game removal, but we filter for it very well. So all this card draw helps make up for that, and Search for Azcanta is another piece that helps out with it too. The front half of Search for Azcanta filters pretty well, and the back half filters really awesome. This is every control deck's dream, Just in response to an opponent's spell, you can always search for Azcanta real quick and try and find a counter spell while their spell's still on the stack. You can just do it at the end of their turn every single turn. An impulse every turn is broken in control. This also drives the land count down a little bit because in the late game, it's essentially just a free land, So that's awesome. It's just really hard to remove on both faces of it, so that's cool. And I should mention this at least one more time. If you've already cast the first approach of the Second Suns, this is 4 cards pretty easily, just right there on the board, that you can filter through and get to that second approach really, really easily. So just Search for Azcanta is the perfect card for this deck. We'll play at least a couple of copies. We'll play 25 lands in this deck. I know I've been talking about how we can drive the land count down, but usually control decks play like 27 lands. So playing 25 lands is relatively low for a control deck. And also, you kind of count Search as a land, so we're playing like 27 lands. There is some tech here. Ipnu Rivulet is another card that can help us get to the second approach really quickly if we need to. That can sometimes be really important. In some matchups, even if you do, when you gain the 7 life off the first approach, they can still kill you in just a couple of turns if they have a somewhat full board, So you want to get to that second approach as quickly as possible, and all of our filtering and Ipnu Rivulet helps with that. Here's our sideboard right here, and I expect control sideboards to change with relative frequency throughout the season, but this is what we've got to look at so far. Scavenger Grounds is in there, mostly against Godfarer's Gift decks, but there's a fair amount of graveyard synergies we have to look out for. Authority of the Consoles is in there to shore up the Ramanap Red matchup. That's pretty much obvious. Negate is in there for the mirror match, and blue-white control isn't the only control deck. You'll sometimes come across Grixis and even Esper control that people are testing out right now. So in other control matchups, Esper Negate is just the best card that we can play. We'll play all 4 of those in the board. We're also going to play a copy of Disallow, not only for the mirror match, but also in more mid-range matchups. We're really just looking to shore up our game 1 against aggro as much as possible. Disallow would normally be in the main deck, but I think there's a couple of cards that are more important for us to play main deck against aggro so we don't auto-lose game 1. Settle the Wreckage will shore up a playset of against Ramonap Red, and Torrential Gearhulk I've already talked about. But there are a couple of cards here that require some explanation, I would say. Definitely the Thopter Arrest is probably jumping out at you right now. This is just our 5th copy of Cast Out. That's not instant speed, but is a little bit faster. Now, sorcery speed is not the most ideal thing for a control deck, but when you need an emergency answer to a Scarab God, or perhaps a Hazoret even, there's just not a whole lot of answers in this color combination for cards like that. We got Settle and we got Cast Out, and those are both awesome, but sometimes you'll just need a even higher concentration of answers against cards like that because they're, again, just the most important cards in the format. This can also, by the way, even if it's not targeting those guys, it can take out stuff like Godfarer's Gift too. So Thopter Arrest is at least wide and versatile, and a lot of these decks don't really have an answer for it. So it's just a 5th cast out that trades off instant speed for a little bit, being a little bit cheaper. I'll do it here. Not everyone will do that in their sideboard, but I like Thopter Arrest. The Gideon in the sideboard needs a little explanation because most people have been playing Gideon in the main deck here, but I'm not sure how much I like Gideon in the main deck right now. A lot of decks with black are packing Vraska's Contempt, and a lot of decks with white are packing Cast Out. 2 pretty easy answers for Gideon. Then we essentially, if we turn on our Gideon, we're just turning on our opponent's really good removal in this format. There's still plenty of answers for an activated Gideon that's a creature. So I'm not really sure how much I like the attack with Gideon strategy because we're giving them 5 turns to find an answer, and most decks do carry an answer. So I'm just not a huge fan of the attack mode on it. And as far as the emblem mode, that would usually be really good, but in our worst matchups like aggro and Sultai Energy, it's just not great to smash a Gideon down in any way because that Gideon has no real onboard protection. We can't throw anything in front of him to block. He's his only real protection in this deck. So his emblem doesn't usually last long, and that kind of makes his first mode the best mode on him. And when his first mode is his best mode, I don't think that's where we want to be with Gideon. I just think he's more of a sideboard card in this format than he is a main decker. And here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 66, not really much different than a lot of control decks and how you're looking at the stats here, It doesn't really care about speed hardly at all, but it does have a little bit higher synergy stat than a lot of control decks do. That's because, again, we're kind of a combo deck, A lot of the deck is constructed to make sure that we can cast Approach twice. So that's kind of synergy. So we get a couple of extra credit points in the category of synergy than a control deck normally would. All of this card draw and the fact that we're only 2 colors pushes the consistency through the roof, and the fact that we're playing 5 main deck sweepers and a bunch of other removal aside from that also pushes the defense really, really high up there. We're a really versatile deck. Cards like Cast Out give us answers to a lot of different stuff in this format, and the fact that we've got counter spells out the wazoo and a bunch of removal and a bunch of card draw to draw into both of those things makes us an incredibly versatile deck, and in some ways, we're really resilient too. Approach, just in and of itself, gaining all that life makes us a resilient deck, and we've got all the sweepers in the world too. So try this thing out. I think right now it's easily the best control deck that you can play in this format, and it's only about $165 to $175 on TCG Player. The neat thing about that is that a lot of the really good decks, quote unquote, in this format right now, looking at you, Teamer, or 4-color Energy, are like $400 right now. For less than half of that, you can play a control deck that shuts those decks down a lot of the time. This deck has good game against a lot of matchups in this format right now, and it's relatively cheap, especially for a control deck, because control decks are often known to be some of the most, expensive decks in the entire format, but not so this time. And especially if you take out the Torrentials and the Gideons, I mean, both of those are just sideboard cards. And at least in what I've got brewed up here, both of those are just sideboard cards. You take those out and you're saving like $50 or so. So, you know, you could build this deck for just a little bit over $100 right now if you subbed in a couple of different things, you know. And there's really no shortage of options. You could always just put in more card draw, more farm to market, even like a third Fumigate would work out, you know. There's just lots of options for this deck right now, and you don't have to spend that much money to play it. But if you do want to buy the deck as is, or even if you want to buy some of it and make modifications to it, just remember, click the first link in the description and that'll take you over to TCG Player. They're my sponsor. You can check out the deck list from there. But I'm tapped out for now. That's all I got for this one, but let me know how you felt about my approach list down there in the comments section. There are some notable differences in my list, sort of in comparison to other lists that have been going around lately. Mostly that I didn't play Gideon in the main deck. That's a big thing, and I made sure to play Opt, which again, not every blue-white deck does. And not every deck plays farm to market. There are some key differences in what I did and what some other people did. But let me know how you feel about all these card choices and what you'd play instead. Make sure you hit the thumbs up if you liked the video. It makes me feel good. You can also sub if you're new. We're hitting a pretty high number of subs now. Thanks for that. Keep doing that. If you haven't subbed yet, make sure you do it. Hit the bell. So we got a ton of amazing deck techs coming up in just the next few weeks here. Ixalan Standard is really broad, actually. I think the budget decks are looking really good in this format, and we got a lot of them coming up. So sub if you haven't done that yet. And if you want to, you can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev or throw us $1 on Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG and keep them deck techs coming. One more thing before I go, actually. My episode of the Kitchen Table Magic podcast is out if you're interested. I'll leave you a link in the description to that down there. And if you're not familiar with the KTM podcast, it's run by Sam Tang, like literally the nicest guy in the entire Magic community. Super awesome dude. And he's talked to a lot of really important people in the community. And I was on the podcast this week, not saying I'm a really important person. It's really awesome to be held to talk to the same guy that talked to those people. But if you want to check out that podcast, again, just click the link in the description box and head on over to Kitchen Table Magic and check me out. And we'll be talking about, like, you know, magic and life and rapping and stuff. Sam asked me about a lot of stuff, the cats, if you're interested. There's a lot of stuff that we cover in the interview, so make sure you check it out. But in any case, I'm Deb from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.